Hello and welcome to the Stoicism question. My name is Donald Robertson, and today's guest is Claudia Mills, an emerita professor of philosophy and award-winning author of more than 60 books for young readers. Her new novel, Calliope Callisto Clark and the Search for Wisdom, is about a difficult young student who joins a philosophy club seeking the wisdom she needs to keep her beloved but equally difficult dog. So, Claudia, welcome to the show. It's nice to have a chance to speak to you about this.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, so thank you so much for hosting me today.
Your book draws on Greek philosophy, but it's not aimed at adults. It's aimed at ages round about 9 to 12, is that right?
Yes, that's exactly right.
To what extent do you think that preteens can benefit from learning about ancient philosophy?
Well, of course, I have a prejudice that everybody, everywhere, can benefit from learning about philosophy, but I'm not alone in this because there's been quite a movement in recent decades to bring philosophy to younger and younger audiences. It's not usually taught in K-12 education. We save it for the university level. But now there is this philosophy for children, or P4C, movement to engage quite young children in dialogue about philosophical questions. The pioneer here has been Gareth Matthews, the late Gareth Matthews from UMass Amherst. And he made the claim that children from the ages of about 3 or 4 to about 7 or 8 raise almost all of the basic questions of philosophy in some form or other. So he uses as an example children saying, "How do I know if I'm dreaming now?" Well, Descartes spent a lot of time on just that question. And so I'm in the company of those other thinkers, but they usually introduce children to philosophy without dragging in the names of Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, Epictetus. But I have this weakness for books and texts and the words of these thinkers that still thrill me to this day. So I try to approach it by incorporating the actual thinkers from the past, not just engaging kids in philosophical inquiry.
I think one of the things that's different about ancient philosophy and how we approach philosophy today is that in the ancient world they had dialogues and they had lectures. But philosophy, people were also exposed to philosophy through anecdotes and through satire. We have like Aristophanes, The Clouds, for example, all about Socrates' philosophy school. So I think it's not a crazy idea that kids could be exposed to philosophy through stories. And in some ways, it has a precedent in the ancient world.
No, I think that's one of the sort of beauties to think about this tradition that's carried forth for millennia that we can engage with today. I know that people who do philosophy for children, while they don't bring in the ancient texts, they do a lot with stories like the Frog and Toad books of Arnold Lobel, which are very philosophical, and the characters have, say, a dilemma about trying not to eat the cookies and showing how much willpower they have by hiding the cookies in more and more different places. So it's really a study about weakness of will, akrasia, and put forth for 5-year-olds.
So what do you think are the aspects of philosophy that are most relevant to kids then? Children, I should say. Like, what do you think is most relevant? Because I guess when people think of academic philosophy today, they probably think much of it that's very abstract and very technical. It's not going to be relevant to young children. But actually, often in ancient philosophy, things are discussed in a more down-to-earth way. But which aspects of philosophy do you think are most relatable to children?
My own field in philosophy is ethics. And when I taught philosophy classes at the university level, I really wanted them to be about how to live your life. And I think, of course, that's of interest to all of us all the time. And I loved getting college students to be thinking about this at age 18 or 19 or 20. And I think children are very drawn to ethical inquiry, certainly in the form of ethical protest. It's not fair. That's
Yeah.
not fair. That's, I think, one of the first utterances of
hmm
children that have moral content. They feel keenly injustice as they experience it.
Yes.
And in fact, in the animal kingdom, even animals have been shown in empirical research to be sensitive to the fair distribution of the bananas, not just who gets the most, but whether they're distributed equitably. So I think that that is very important to children. So,
And they do ask a lot of questions. Children often ask what things mean.
right, what is this and why is this?
Yeah, yeah. So I think, and there might be ways that philosophy can be made more interactive and more of a game to them and linked to anecdotes. Actually, when I mentioned anecdotes, I was thinking not just of Aristophanes, but in the satires, but also of Diogenes Laertius. It's full of these kind of little stories and anecdotes, and the Cynic tradition as well has lots of little anecdotes. So when my daughter was young, I used to tell her stories about Diogenes the Cynic and about Socrates. I think she was very disappointed one day, though, when she discovered that Diogenes wasn't actually a dog. She kind of got it in her head somehow that he was literally a dog that went around doing philosophy. She looked slightly downcast when I explained to her. It was just wasn't
One of the
literally
many
a dog.
disillusionments that
Yeah.
children are going to encounter as they go on their
So,
journey through life.
do you think children, in some ways, have an advantage over adults when it comes to learning about philosophy?
Well, as we've just been saying, children are sort of natural philosophers in some
hmm
sense. You know, you have the line from Socrates that wonder is the beginning of wisdom. And to
hmm
to children, the whole world is a wondrous,
hmm
strange, unfamiliar place that they are trying to figure out. And that why question is the one that most drives parents crazy with its
hmm
insistence. You answer one, as soon as you answer the question, you get, well, why that answer? And then you give
Yeah.
another answer, and that endless sequence of whys. And one thing I used to say about philosophers is that philosophers are the grown-ups who still
hmm
ask the questions the other grown-ups have stopped asking.
I was thinking
So
in some ways, maybe children are more open minded, more flexible.
exactly, I was going to say that they have fewer settled convictions about
Yes.
what the answer should be. They are
Yeah.
asking the questions not knowing what the answer should be. And even by the time you get to the university, students have a lot of settled convictions, often accepted uncritically from parents
Yeah.
and teachers. And so there's a lot of work to undo the assumptions with which they arrive. But children have no preconceived notions. The whole world is new to them.
Yeah. I think it's possible that Socrates discovered this. Like he went, we're told originally he approached some of the men of Athens that were known for wisdom, like the sophists and politicians. But over time, I believe that he increasingly began to do philosophy with the youth of Athens. And it may be that he found that people had a reputation for wisdom weren't the best partners for philosophical dialogue because they had, particularly sophists, had too much to lose by admitting they were wrong, potentially. Whereas nobody considered the youth of Athens to be wise. And therefore, it meant they were potentially more open minded and able to engage in a proper philosophical dialogue.
And of course, that's was a fatal course of activity for Socrates, who was condemned to death by the
Yes.
people of Athens for corrupting the young
Yeah.
precisely by inviting them to question received wisdom.
Well, let's hope that's not a consequence of your new
No, no, no. My new book will have very salutary consequences.
So, I guess a good question to follow on from that is how can parents help their children to learn about and benefit from philosophy?
Well, I think in terms of this openness we've just been talking about, I think to cultivate that openness rather than repressing it and to love the questions themselves. And parents have to model doing this.
hmm
In fact, I think parents themselves have to relearn, you might say, some
Yeah.
childish ways, and
Mm-hmm.
reclaim that open-mindedness. And so, for example, when children ask these incessant why questions, rather than being impatient with them and trying just to cut it off because you're busy or doing something else, which of course it's perfectly legitimate for parents to do. We are busy and we do have other demands on our time, but to take children's questions seriously and to be willing to go along and have that spirit of play that children have. And if children, say their own answers to a question, not immediately label those as wrong, but explore the ways in which there might be an insight there, and or ask those probing kinds of, well, what about this?
Yeah.
Gentle nudging toward a counterexample that
Mm-hmm.
helps them. So it goes back to what you were just saying about dialogue in ancient
Yeah.
Greece. Engage in real, genuine dialogue with your children, not
Mm-hmm.
as the supreme giver of all
Yeah.
incontrovertible answers, but in that spirit of exploration with them.
Well, I think you've said something very profound there. Is people are often asking me about how they could teach psychological skills to their kids and stuff like that, and maybe bring a philosophy into it. And I think often my experience is that when people are asking a question, in many cases the problem is they're asking the wrong question, or they're approaching it from the wrong perspective. They're making an assumption that's kind of getting in their ways. So they want me to tell them what they should say to their kids, or tell their kids to teach them a skill. And often I say, well, actually, what the research tells us in psychology is that it would be probably more effective for you to model the thing that you want to teach, the behavior or the attitudes that you want your kids to learn. And that's kind of not on their radar initially. It seems that often like an aha moment or a revelation to them. Oh, so I should actually learn to exhibit some of these psychological skills, or intellectual humility, I think, is what you're alluding to here. So as parents, maybe if we exhibit curiosity, openness, and intellectual humility, that might be something that our children emulate and are encouraged by.
The sad truth I think about parenting is that what we do is more important than what we say.
Yeah.
And as they see us acting, this is what they're going to be trying to emulate.
So we'd have to admit that we're wrong sometimes. Shock horror. Like,
That we're wrong, or that there's just a different viewpoint that
yeah.
that deserves more weight than we're willing to give it, and to take the insights of children seriously. One thing I used to say as a college teacher to myself when I would be frustrated by some of the ridiculous, preposterous things students would say in class, I'd say, remind myself, there's nothing so ridiculous said in class by a freshman that hasn't been said in print by some famous philosopher.
That's
You
probably
know,
true.
so that helped me foster a spirit of open inquiry in my classrooms.
What do you think? Do you think there are particular questions that are useful to ask children,
Well, I
and maybe
think,
ask ourselves?
yeah, I think it's actually more helpful. Well, I don't know. I'm hardly an expert on this. I'm better. It's not as if I had this model practice as a parent myself, but I think to make use, start by making use of the questions children ask you as they live their daily lives. Why is my friend being so mean?
Mm,
Why do I have to share my
right.
toys? Do you think my goldfish loves me? When will I be big?
Uh-huh.
Start with their questions. And then, as you were talking about anecdotes, I
Mm-hmm.
think stories are so important. And as you read to your children, you're going to encounter characters who are making choices. And choices are a fascinating thing to ponder. In fact, choice is at the heart of Stoicism, as I'm sure we'll talk about in a bit. But you'll see characters making choices, and to say to your child, what would you do in that situation? Do you think that they made the right choice? Why do you think that? And it also gives children this kind of vicarious agency, like, what would I do if I were in that position?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Fairy tales are full of situations where you want to say, you know, you want to press back on the characters and what they are doing and saying, and
Yeah.
ask questions about them. Even the simplest stories are fodder for this kind of deeper discussion.
I used to have a rule that whenever my daughter watched a movie, we had to agree that we were going to have a conversation about it and discuss like the characters afterwards. Sometimes we kind of pause in the middle and we'd kind of discuss what was going on. Sometimes we talk about the way the movie had been directed, but often we talk about the characters. Even with when she was very young, just saying, is this character a good guy or a bad guy, or maybe a bit of both? And having her to kind of define that and think through what it means. But actually, another question that I like to ask her, which was kind of tricky at first. Calliope's searching for wisdom in your book, from what I understand. I used to ask my daughter a tough question. I'd ask her, I'd say to her, have you heard of the word wisdom, right? And I think most young kids have kind of come across the concept. I said, what does it mean? What is wisdom? So she's searching in your book for wisdom. What do you think wisdom is? How, or at least, how could we even attempt to answer that question?
Well, she doesn't really quite yet know what she's seeking for. So, at some point, I guess I have to enter the events of the story a little bit to make this clear. She has an instrumental reason for seeking wisdom. She is an orphan. Her parents die at a young age. She's being raised by her elderly grandparents. She is an intellectually precocious but emotionally intense child whose grandparents basically don't understand her or have a sense of what to do with her. And her teacher at school is a very old school teacher who does not welcome inquiry, does not welcome questioning, does not welcome passionately expressed disruptive opinions in the class. And so that's what Callie has been being perceived as difficult at home and at school. Her grandparents have gotten her a dog, thinking this will calm her, this will even out her moods. The dog has become as much of a problem as Callie herself. As the book opens, Callie's had an altercation with her teacher, coming to the defense of her friend, because Callie has that keen sense of justice and fairness that children have that we were just talking about. The teacher calls home, the grandmother's racing to the phone to hear the rest of the teacher's message, trips over the dog who's maximally in the way, falls and breaks her wrist. So the dog is not working out. And I just, as a personal aside, I wrote this just months before a grandchild careened into me and knocked me down in a parking lot by mistake, and I broke my elbow. So life can imitate art. But the grandparents say this, the dog's not working out. The dog has to be rehomed. And Callie's desperate and sobbing, having the world's biggest meltdown, and they say they're going to relent. She can keep the dog if there's no more problems like this. At the same time in school, they're studying Greek philosophy, and this unsympathetic teacher mentions that this was the birthplace of Greece, was the birthplace of philosophy. And these great thinkers such as Socrates and Epictetus, they never even wrote down their wise words. Their followers were so taken by their wisdom that they wrote it down to preserve it for millennia, for posterity. And Callie thinks, I need some of that if I'm going to keep my dog. So she doesn't even know what wisdom is yet, and she's going to find out a lot about it. But right now she knows she needs to do something, and she's heard that these people are like experts on how to live your life, and she has this very high stake of losing her dog if she can't change. And that's her impetus for forming
that's her motivation
at school.
Well, so she's seeking it for instrumental reasons, but I still want to press you on my question.
Please do. Please do.
So, philosophy means in this the love of wisdom. What is wisdom? What do philosophers love if they love wisdom?
Oh boy, you'd think that a person who wrote a book with this title would have the answer at the ready, which I do not.
No, that's a good sign though, because it shows that you think it's a difficult question. And you've sometimes you've spent a long time thinking about something. It's harder to answer a question about it.
I think the first thing is to contrast it just with knowledge. Knowledge as an accumulation of facts, as an accumulation of techniques, as an accumulation of skills. That's all under the heading of knowledge. that wisdom is to know what to do with that knowledge
Yes.
and to know how to employ it in the service of making your own life go better and the lives of those around you, and maybe even the world as a whole go better because of these things that you have learned. It's having that deeper understanding, that maybe the why question of why it matters and what to do with this and how to. So in a way, it comes back also, maybe that's a little bit instrumental too, to say, I want to make my life go better. I want to make the lives of those around me go better. I want to make the world a better place. But it goes beyond just trying to achieve some narrowly defined objective. And it breaks my heart when I see students today wanting so much to leave college with a job and the idea of future. And I'm not going to deny the importance of making a living and the importance of finding work that's satisfying to you, but that narrow focus on how much money am I going to make when I get out of this place, that is almost the antithesis of wisdom, to have that narrow focus. It's a wider angle look at yourself and the universe.
I think that's a pretty good way of looking at it. Now, and you sound a little bit like Epictetus. I was tempted to say when you say that. But I think that he's one of the philosophers that features in Callie's story. So I wanted to ask you, was there something in particular that drew you to Epictetus or to Stoicism in this regard?
Well, Epictetus was the philosopher I first fell in love with. When I think I was about 15 years old, I was in a bookstore at a shopping mall in suburban New Jersey, and there was a Walden bookstore, and I picked up this book, The Stoic and Epicurean Philosophers, this thick tome, and I opened it up to Epictetus, and I saw these words where the tyrant is saying to Epictetus, betray the secret. And Epictetus says, I will not. And the tyrant says, then I will chain you. And Epictetus says, what say you, fellow? Chain me? My leg you will chain, but my will? Not even Zeus can conquer that. I read that at 15, and I was sold. I went on to college and majored in philosophy and gave my life to philosophy because of those words of Epictetus. He was the beginning of everything for me. So he was just my guy. Now, that said, I don't know particularly much about Epictetus, and I have not studied Stoicism deeply. And here's a terrible confession to make to a man who wrote a book called, How to Think Like Marcus Aurelius. Is that
How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. I thought that was catchier.
Yeah, How to Think Like a Roman Emperor. Yeah. I have not read Marcus Aurelius. It was Epictetus. I gave my heart to him. I never let my gaze stray.
Wow. So you know what you'd like about Marcus Aurelius had read Epictetus. He's like a fanboy of Epictetus in a way. So you might have something in common with him in that regard. I'll tell you some. Try not to get too much into trivia, but it might be relevant to you. I think in the ancient world, generally speaking, Greeks and definitely Romans would be more likely to be introduced to philosophy from round about age like 15 onwards ish. But we're told Marcus Aurelius was unusual in that he began to study philosophy when he was 12. That's what we're told by the Roman historians.
I also love about Stoicism that its two maybe greatest adherents, one a slave and one an emperor.
Yeah.
It has two such different positions in life, and both find their way to the same body of ethical thought.
And the paradox as well is that Marcus Aurelius, one of the most powerful man in the known world in the West at that time, had his role model was a slave, Epictetus. So the guy that he turned to for inspiration was a slave, interestingly. So Epictetus is someone that inspired you. But is there anything in particular? Can we see Epictetus's influence in this book?
Oh, totally. So just to give a little more about the different philosophers to which Callie's exposed, Greek philosophy is featured just because she hears about this through studying ancient Greece. And I knew the books were going to be too hard for her realistically to read. So there's a school librarian who's very sympathetic, and he agrees to form this little philosophy club where he kind of
Okay.
helps the kids through these texts. And there's only 3 kids in the club: Callie, her best friend who doesn't even want to do it, and her nemesis, this boy who's her rival. And so there's just the 3 of them. And I thought a lot about what I wanted to introduce to the kids. So I do start with Socrates and his questioning of the people in Athens, because I thought that models this kind of dialogue and philosophical inquiry. And then I was drawn by his willingness to drink that hemlock when Crito is urging him to escape, and he stays to drink it. And that's a great question to ask kids. What would you do? Would you escape, or would you stay there and take the punishment that the people of Athens have decreed for you? And so, that was something I wanted to include. And then in Plato, I just chose the ring of Gyges from the Republic, because the question of, if you found a ring that would turn you invisible, would you still act as you do now?
Yeah.
If you could misbehave with impunity, would you be tempted to do it? And I have to say, I gave a talk about the book a couple weeks ago to a group of middle school students. When I asked them this question, every kid had a hand in the air to tell me what they would do if they were invisible. So it's very powerful. But what Callie finds as she's engaging all these questions, none of them are helping her figure out how to be perfect enough to keep her dog.
Yeah.
And spoiler alert, nothing she learns in the whole course of the book is going to help her do that. But she's going to learn something. She's going to find a wisdom that she didn't even know she was seeking. And then that led me to the parts of the book where Epictetus, because it was all about Epictetus. It was all building to bringing him on the stage. And Callie, as I was, is very drawn to standing up to the tyrant. Her tyrant is her teacher, and her teacher has been unfair to her friend. And at the moment of the book's, well, I don't know what, I'm not so good at, even though I've written all these books, I'm not so good at knowing what is the climax. There's like one of the most exciting moments, shall we say, the crucial defining moment for her of the book is when she feels that the teacher has been very unfair again to her friend, and she needs to defend her friend by refusing this demand of the teacher, even though she knows the teacher will call home and it'll be strike 3 for her, and she will lose her dog. So philosophy is working against her instrumental purposes. It may take away the very reason she signed up for it in the first place, because she's going to do what she thinks is right, whatever it costs. So, but the piece of wisdom of Epictetus is the most important, is what's going to get her through a crisis in her life she doesn't even know it's going to come. And that is that there are 2 kinds of things in life, the things you can control and the things you can't. And I'll let you chime in, because once I start talking about this, I could talk just forever. But
yeah, that would be good. But that's the first thing he says, or that is written down in the Enchiridion. So it must be important.
Well, it's everything. Opening. It's everything. Yeah. And it works both ways. It's both gives you a much stronger sense of your own responsibility and agency, but also a much weaker sense of it, in the sense that there's so much that you can't control. And in particular, it's other people that you can't control. And I love when someone comes to Epictetus and says, "Tell me what to do about my brother's anger." And he says, "I have nothing to say to you about your brother's anger. If your brother wants to come to me, I have things I can say to him, but I have nothing to say to you about your brother's anger." And so Callie realizes, because she's difficult, everyone keeps blaming her because her grandfather has high blood pressure. It's because of Callie. And when he then has a stroke, she's haunted by the guilt that she made this happen. She made him get so upset. And when she internalizes the message that you can't make other people do anything for good or ill, you can only make yourself do things. And she realizes that she's not responsible for everything that happens to everybody else, but she's deeply responsible for herself and what she does. And it's, both liberatory and burdensome, that realization of how much you are in control of your own life, but how little you are in control of anything else.
But this makes it sound like a kind of rite of passage and that she, as if she's achieving a kind of emotional maturity in the process of learning about philosophy. And that's a level of maturity that a lot of people never achieve.
Well, it's certainly one that I haven't. After when I used to teach this course on how to live your life that had started with Aristotle, Epictetus, Kant, Mill, Nietzsche, Sartre. But the week I taught Epictetus, I was so good at internalizing all these lessons the week I taught him. But then I'd be back to complaining and blaming others for my choices. It's a struggle. It's a process. It's not a one and done thing. I don't think for most people a conversion moment where you see the light and you're born again as a Stoic. I think it's a daily task to remember that core lesson.
So let me just recap who gets name checked in this book. Epictetus and Socrates are definitely in it. Are there any other philosophers that you mention along the way?
Just Plato. The teacher mentions Aristotle just as part of a thorough little review. If I were to write a sequel, I was thinking John Stuart Mill would be.
Oh, really? Interesting.
I think On Liberty is a book we all need to read right now because of the way he defends freedom of thought and expression in a time when it's so challenged in our society.
Interesting. Well, I look forward to reading that. What is the relationship between Epictetus and Socrates? Like, you've got them in bed together here in the sense here in the book to get alongside each other. Do you think they're complementary? I mean, Epictetus certainly had a great admiration for Socrates, but they're separated by 4 centuries.
I don't know if I can answer that, but so much of Epictetus's book, because it was written down by his followers, is in the form of a dialogue. You hear people coming to Epictetus with questions and Epictetus turning some of the questions back to them and engaging in that dialogue. So I think the importance of dialogue would be a point of continuity between the two of them.
And Epictetus tells his students that Socrates is the main person they should seek to emulate. Interestingly, he kind of almost gives us a little list of the people that he admires. And what's curious about that historically is he puts Socrates ahead of Zeno or the other founders of Stoicism as the number one person that they should be looking up to. Marcus Aurelius doesn't talk about Socrates as much, though, for some strange reason. I wanted to ask you, because of the way that you described Callie's journey in the book, you didn't use the word, and it's one of my favorite words, therapeutic. But it sounded like that, as though philosophy was becoming, in some sense, therapeutic, or that it could be viewed as contributing towards emotional or psychological well-being. So I thought that'd be an interesting angle to explore.
Yes, there's this moment in the book where she marvels, did Epictetus have any idea what a difference his words would make to her, all these centuries later? Because this relief when she realizes the limit of her responsibility for her grandfather's he's a cranky, curmudgeonly, but loving. But he's a cranky, curmudgeonly old man who's mad about all kinds of things. And the fact that she does something that gets him into a state is not her fault. And that enormous, enormous relief. So I think that it is therapeutic for her. But I also know that she, like the rest of us, is going to have to learn this over and over again. And this the owning of your own choices, though, too. It's and not casting blame on others for them. But I do see it as therapeutic.
Do you think there are any other ways in which philosophy becomes therapeutic for her? So there's the kind of distinction between what's up to us and what isn't. And that sounds pretty central. It's definitely central to Stoicism, as we mentioned. Are there other therapeutic benefits that she gets from philosophy, or other ways in which it kind of contributes to her personal well-being.
Well, she's very drawn. She's so much like my younger self. She's very drawn by the passage where Epictetus talks about being the purple thread, that he doesn't want to be the ordinary, because children have a lot of egotism, or at least Callie does. And he just says, I don't. Different men sell for different prices. He's not even that critical of how it sounds to me. I have to admit, I'm not a scholar of Epictetus at all. I'm a lover of Epictetus, but I'm not a scholar. But he seems to me, if you want to, if the tyrant demands that you hold the chamber pot, or else you'll get a beating, and you think that that's the choice you want to make, by all means make it, but just don't complain, that mean old tyrant made you do it, because it was your choice. And the idea that different men sell at different prices, and be careful what price you sell yourself at, and that you want to hold yourself to a higher standard. And so Callie's interested in this idea of being the purple thread, and she's reviewing some of her actions. Was this a purple thread kind of thing to do, or was this not a purple thread kind of thing to do? And moments where she has had a total meltdown and gotten upset about being teased about something trivial. She thinks Epictetus never would have done that.
Yes.
But her standing up to her teacher at that key moment. And I'll just show you the cover of the book has Epictetus wearing a purple scarf.
Ah, that's nice.
So the illustrator brought the purple thread in to give this bust of Epictetus a purple scarf. And I love that little touch.
This comes from, I assume, if I remember rightly, the senatorial robes have purple, but they were only allowed to have a strip of purple thread or purple band that designated their status.
But it adds the distinction and beauty to the garment, and
it changes everything.
Yes, and these are the people who then become our heroes, are the ones who were willing to stand up to the tyrant and risk everything for that.
You're touching on something that I think is actually a recurring theme in Epictetus. And if I was a better scholar, maybe I would know where he gets this from, because he probably doesn't invent it. It was probably already around in Greek culture. I'm not sure which other authors mention it. I don't think it's as prominent in Plato, but he talks a lot about this idea of our behavior as a kind of transaction. We make certain sacrifices and what the consequences or the cost is that we're paying. It reminds me of the saying in the New Testament, what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul? Because Epictetus says, if you think of this as a transaction, is it ever worthwhile sacrificing your wisdom or sacrificing your virtue in order to gain some kind of status or material advantage?
Because nothing else is as important as that.
Nothing is comparable in value.
Because after the tyrant says, I'll chain you, and he says, what chain you? My leg you will chain. He says, I'll behead you. And Epictetus basically says, so? When did I ever tell you I was the only man who could not be beheaded? Whoa.
Yeah. He's quite funny in places. He's charismatic, Epictetus, I would say. He reminds me in some ways, I have to say, of Albert Ellis, who's a famous psychotherapist who was influenced by Epictetus. And he's also known for having quite a brusque, kind of confrontational style. But for many people, that has a kind of charm to it.
Exactly.
He also says, and it's not clear whether he's talking about himself or not sometime in the dialogue, but there's a bit, and he seems to be referring to Domitian expelling the philosophers and kind of banning philosophy at one point. He says, you say that I have to cut off my beard, which was a symbol of being a philosopher. So a beard means nothing to Epictetus, but what matters would be the kind of betraying his principles. It'd be like, would you shake hands with a tyrant or something like that? He's not willing to submit himself to authority in this way. He says, if you want to cut off my beard, he says, sure. If you want to cut off my beard, you have to cut off my head first.
I I love his brusque style. I love
Yeah,
when someone says, "My nose is running," and he goes, "Well, wipe it. Well, wipe
yeah.
it. But why shouldn't, my nose be running? How much? Why have you hands but to wipe it?" And if someone comes to him, "My leg is lame." He goes, "For that, you accuse the universe?"
Hmm.
And oh, if I get started, I just want to quote him endlessly because I love how stern he is. And he really gets you out of your little petty day-to-day complaints.
There's a bit that I always remember where he's talking about somebody. He'd been told that somebody had criticized him. And he said his response to that is bizarre, paradoxical, and I'm sure it was intended to be humorous. So I think somebody tells him that someone has been speaking ill of him, criticizing him. And Epictetus says, well, he's obviously ignorant and doesn't know what he's talking about, because if he did, he would have mentioned all of my other flaws as well.
I don't know if I remember that line, but I remember him. Someone says to him, "What I want is that I walk down the street and everyone says, 'There goes the great philosopher.'" And he
Hmm.
says, "But are these not the very people who you have been describing as madmen? Why would you
Yeah.
want to be praised by madmen?" And I feel that in my own life as an author, I'm always wanting the good reviews and the accolades from the world. And I see the
Hmm.
books that are getting them. And sometimes they are truly wonderful. I'm not going to
Hmm.
badmouth my fellow authors, but sometimes I think these judges just don't have very good judgment. But then
Hmm.
if I don't think they have very good judgment, why am I so hungering for their accolades when I have just already dismissed their judgment as being something that I don't value?
I think it's true. I think it's an interesting thing for authors to. Sure, there was a book that someone published once that contained bad reviews that famous authors had received. It's kind of interesting to put things in perspective. You know who got bad reviews? It was Shakespeare. There was another author who called him an upstart crow and said that he thought his plays were pretentious garbage. Um, and T.S. Eliot thought that Hamlet was a mess, and it wasn't well written. So even authors that we admire and that are beyond question. Uh, I think in the sciences, the person I always think of, and you could come up with many examples, but sometimes when I'm talking to clients, dealing with criticism, you can't please all the people all the time. I'll say, Charles Darwin, was absolutely ridiculed at the time. People drew cartoons of him, show it like a monkey, like making fun of him. They thought he was absurd, ridiculous figure. Um, so just because you get bad reviews or criticism, it doesn't necessarily reflect on the character of your work necessarily. And in fact, if you're doing something that's genuinely unusual or original, for example, you're probably gonna encounter people that
Hmm.
don't like it or don't get it. And usually, if you look through history, it's when people are doing kind of original or innovative things they get. Oh, my other favorite example is Jimi Hendrix got booed off stage on one of the first tours that he went on, because he supported the Monkees, and it was the wrong audience. It was kind of an audience of teeny boppers, and they didn't get his music, so they booed him off stage. So should he have sulked off and quit, like throwing his guitar
No,
in the
no,
bit?
never.
So I was going to ask you just to deepen that a little bit more and think. Do you think there are other ways, like maybe even beyond what you covered in this particular book? Are there other ways you think that philosophy in general or Stoicism in particular could benefit young people? How could it help them? Do you think there's other ways that it could help their psychological well being, for example?
I think it can help. Well, very young children, you can't do anything with, in a way. You can engage them in philosophical inquiry,
Yeah,
but I was going to talk about emotional regulation, and it's going
yeah.
to be hard to regulate the emotions of a 3-year-old very much because they are not really amenable yet to
Hmm.
reasoning through some situations. But I think the idea that anything can be taken by, one of two handles, and you have to decide which way
Mm.
to take that. And in the book, I actually have the kids push back on one part of Epictetus, just how much he tries to eliminate negative emotions from our life.
Mm-hmm.
When he says, if you love a jug, know that it is the kind of thing that gets broken. And then when
Mm-hmm.
your jug is broken, you will not be sad. If you love a child, know that a child is the kind of creature who dies. Then when your child dies, you will not be sad. Well, I'm with him with the jug, but with the child, whoa, whoa. But that doesn't mean I want to, spend 5 years in grief or accuse the universe and why me and this is so unfair. That this is a part of life, and certainly in Epictetus's time, until the advent
Yes.
of penicillin and antibiotics, people died young all the
Yeah.
time.
Oh,
But
yeah.
Callie and her friends in this philosophy club think, Callie thinks, if my grandfather died, would Epictetus say I shouldn't even be sad? And pretty much yes. I mean, that death is not a great loss to Socrates. Oh, and that's another commonality, Socrates and Epictetus, that death is not a great loss. But still, this is where, and I didn't get to bring in Aristotle, but Aristotle would is better. It's more appealing than Epictetus in sort of allowing all the emotions, but having that golden mean to try to have the right emotions in the right degree for the right reasons and the right situations, rather than just having such an unwillingness to countenance that kind of response to life's pain and suffering. That said, though, I think Callie gets to hear that, death is part of life. And her grandfather's in his 80s. He's had a stroke. He's very likely to die in the next few years of her life. And that this is some like reality that you're going to have to accept because it's outside of your control. And yes, there may be the mourning and the grieving, but not to have this unseat you completely. So I think that kind of emotional equanimity, if it's not carried too far, is a benefit of Stoicism for children of an age more like Callie's, though, than the 3-year-old in the middle of the tantrum.
Yeah. You reminded me of something, actually. When my daughter was about 6, I said to her one day, there was a famous philosopher once called Epictetus, and he said, everything has 2 handles. And she looked at me for a minute and kind of smiled, and she thought about it. And then she said, that's not true, Daddy. Like, so she took it a bit literally at first. I thought, let me explain. He didn't mean it literally. All right, let me explain. It's what we call a metaphor. Like, it's an example of sometimes kids think in slightly more concrete terms. I've thought of another psychological benefit. It's a mystery in broad daylight. There's another, I think, an important benefit, probably more of the Socratic method. And I think it might be an area more deserving of future research. It's something that we already know quite a lot about in the field of psychology and psychotherapy research, but it's definitely clearly connected to certain approaches to philosophy. But the connection hasn't really been studied or developed much. And that is a thing called cognitive flexibility. So, cognitive flexibility is our capacity to view things from different perspectives, at least like we were talking about earlier, and to have a degree of intellectual humility, and not have tunnel vision and be kind of rigidly locked into a particular perspective on things. I would say Socrates comes across, I think it's fair to say, I think it would be reasonable to say that Socrates comes across in the dialogues as a guy with an extraordinary capacity for cognitive flexibility. He's able to kind of really question other people's and his own deepest assumptions and explore different ways, unusual ways of looking at things. He's very open to engaging in dialogue, modifying his position. So I think philosophy perhaps teaches, as almost could be viewed as a certain type of Socratic questioning, Socratic dialogue could be viewed almost as a training in cognitive flexibility. Now, what do we know about that? Well, surprise, surprise, cognitive flexibility is better for emotional well-being than cognitive inflexibility. Like
No,
There's
I
lots
can
of
see that.
research that substantiate that, right? And so, insofar as philosophy, particularly the Socratic method, could be viewed as something pretty directly gives us that ability, it should contribute to psychological well-being. It doesn't always work like that in practice. So I kind of feel like there's maybe just one or two tweaks or adjustments required. So I think often people compartmentalize their skills. So we might be doing philosophy and talking about justice and practicing in the seminar room cognitive flexibility, but then we go out into the real world and we kind of abandon that skill to some extent when we get angry with a bank or a lawyer or something like that, or the news. But learning to transfer that skill and generalize it to other situations, would potentially be a way that practicing philosophy, even modern academic philosophy, could contribute. Now, the downside is that the other thing that we know is bad for well-being is something called a ruminative thinking style. And I could be wrong about this, but I think academia in general sometimes encourages ruminative thinking,
No
and
kidding.
possibly philosophers are some of the worst offenders in that regard. So we'd have to kind of it'd be worth considering, like, how could we get the cognitive flexibility from philosophy without ending up getting sucked into a ruminative thinking style? It could go either way.
No,
Those are some of the
definitely.
is philosophy could teach us to overthink things, but it could also potentially teach us how to be more intellectually humble and open-minded. So I think I just wanted to kind of wrap up by asking you then, is there anything else that you wanted to mention? Do you think there are any other ideas, concepts from the book or from ancient philosophy in general that you want to leave our listeners with, that
Well,
you wanted to make
tying
sure that you mention?
in with what you just said about cognitive flexibility, there's one issue that comes out to play in the book. Now, not everything gets linked to philosophy because, of course, I have to tell a story, and this is not a philosophy tome
Mm-hmm.
or lesson. I took a lot of risk to give as much space as I did to these philosophical discussions. But Callie has a chance to see how often her own assumptions about other people's behaviors and motivations are the problem. So she gets a chance to revisit some of these assumptions and find that other people's point of view is different from what she thought. So it comes up with her rival, Philip Kumar. He thinks he's so perfect. He thinks he's smarter than I am, but I'm smarter than he is. And so she has all of this. And then there's a moment where she realizes all of this was projected onto him. He
Mm-hmm.
didn't, he wasn't someone who thought he was so perfect. She was afraid he was so perfect that she's the one who's competitive. She invented all this really out of whole cloth in a way and imposed this on him. And then there's a moment of redemption for the tyrant teacher, where, and though this is with some adult intervention, the principal of the school helping her see that the teacher has her ways for her. She has her own story, she has her own journey, but that the teacher is not as much of a tyrant and not as much of an enemy and not as much of a foe as Callie thought. And so the idea that you can be wrong about other people's character, emotions, actions, and you can interpret them in a more or less charitable way. I think that's another thing I tried to bring out in the book, but I didn't tie it directly back to philosophy. But I think it was partly because of these philosophical discussions Callie's been having with Philip in this club that she starts to understand him in a better and deeper way. Just talking to other people is a way of understanding them better and
And
correcting
understanding
some
ourselves.
misapprehensions and understanding ourselves.
Well, I think that's been a smashing discussion once again. Thank you very
Well, thank
much
you so much. This
for
has been
joining me.
a lot of fun.
I think it has. I've had a lot of fun too. So we hope that you, our listeners, enjoyed the conversation as much as we did and had as much fun as we did. Please share the link with your friends. Go crazy and spread it all over the internet if you like. Subscribe to my newsletter, Stoicism, Philosophy as a Way of Life. Rush out and buy as many copies as you possibly can of the book. And thank you for listening. It's goodbye from me, Donald Robertson, and from my guest, Claudia Mills. So bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.